Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening, this is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Susan Berman was reared in the lap of Las Vegas luxury as the daughter of Davie Berman, a notorious casino mogul and Mafia leader. It wasn't until college, well after her father's death, that she learned what he really was and really did. She ultimately dedicated her life to learning about Vegas and its underworld bosses, publishing 2 books on the subject, Easy Street and Lady Las Vegas. Her story takes a turn for the bizarre in 1982 when Cathy Durst, the wife of college friend and heir to a New York real estate fortune, Robert Durst, mysteriously disappeared. Robert Durst was the primary suspect, but no charges were laid. Shortly after the Cathy Durst case was reopened, Susan Berman was found shot in the back of the head, mob execution style. No forced entry, no robbery, nothing missing. Again, Robert is a suspect. Did Susan know her killer? Did she have knowledge about Cathy Durst's death? Murder of a Mafia daughter, the life and tragic death of Susan Berman by my special guest, Cathy Scott. I do not have Cathy Scott on the air. Maybe she's just late getting to the phone to be able to call in for the program. I do have, I guess a couple announcements to make as well while we wait for her to contact the program. The book we are discussing tonight is Murder of a Mafia Daughter, The Life and Tragic Death of Susan Berman by Cathy Scott. It is really the story that you have seen in Casino and more so in the movie Bugsy starring Warren Beatty, where there is primarily involves the arrangement between Meyer Lansky, Davie Berman, and Bugsy Siegel, and basically the founders of Las Vegas, as the story goes, members of the Jewish Mafia, Meyer Lansky being the money man, and Bugsy Siegel, as you see in the movie, a very flamboyant and outgoing person that believed in the Las Vegas idea that the mob could go and sort of clean up their act in Las Vegas, make it for everyone, and make a ton of cash. And so a lot of people are fairly familiar with the story from the Bugsy Siegel movie starring Warren Beatty and from Casino starring Robert De Niro and a cast of many reputable mob-type actors or actors playing mob members. While we wait to get Cathy Scott on the line, and this is the second time she has been on the program. The first time was very early on in the near the inception of the program, and her book was The Rough Guide to True Crime, a compilation of basically the most interesting, notorious, infamous criminals involved in true crime, primarily killers, but also she featured some infamous robbery and thieves in her book, and Mafia members. Anyway, what I'm going to tell you about next week is that hold on to your seats, because especially for our American audience that's not as familiar with this story, and in fact, I shouldn't even say that. No one is familiar with this story. Basically, people have just gotten snippets from the Canadian press. This is another really, really high-profile case. Robert Willie Pickton, accused of 49 murders, actually charged with 26. Particularly grisly and bizarre and gruesome tale of a serial killer who fed the remains of his victims to the pigs that were on his farm. there has been a publication ban for a few years till the appeal was finally concluded early this year. A very reputable journalist and author has decided to do two books about the Pickton case. The first one was called The Pickton Files, and this one is called On the Farm, Robert William Pickton and the Tragic Story of Vancouver's Missing Women. This is Stevie Cameron. She's known for writing a book about Canada's Prime Minister called On the Take, exposing the German, I guess, arms dealer salesman, his name is Schreiber, and the relationship between Canada's Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney. And her book was called On the Take. So, investigative journalist, not afraid to get her fingers dirty, I guess, looking into big stories and not worried about ruffling any feathers. And she's decided to write this book on the farm. Is 750 pages. Comes out in hardcover by Knopf, Knopf, Knopf. And incredible book. I've just started this book because I've been very busy, but it's just an amazing book. It's one of the most spectacular trials and cases in true crime history, absolutely, without any exaggeration whatsoever. The details of what the police found. There are some victims that narrowly escaped death at the hands of Robert Pickton. It is, again, at least another story of police ineptitude at a very, very high level, ignoring one of their own and chastising them and actually demoting them because one of their own had suggested that there was a serial killer at work in the Vancouver area in British Columbia, Canada, and no one listened to this gentleman, and sure enough, that's what they had operating in the Vancouver, just outside the Vancouver area for many years. There is part of the book, and she'll talk about it on the program, I'm sure, because I'll be asking this question. There is now talk that has leaked out from various stories, and again, the press has been very hesitant to report very much. There's a publication ban, but also there's great outcry in Canada over graphic detail. The Bernardo Homolka case, or any type of case where there's graphic testimony, evidence, gruesome details. Canadians, unlike Americans, don't want to know. We live somewhat sheltered life, and I think I've said it before, as Canadians, we believe that we're very much different than Americans. We believe, honestly, that Americans are much more violent than we are as Canadians, from what we see. And your higher murder rates are just, I guess, part of that evidence for them. However, when we do see the kind of shocking and gruesome and bizarre and horrific crimes like we're used to hearing somewhat routinely in America, in the bigger cities, and sometimes not in bigger cities, that Canadians, I then believe, are in denial that we are very, very similar to Americans. And if we were to have the kind of social situations or social problems that America has, and combined with access to handguns and Canada, very much like the United States, experiences a lot of murder and violence as a result of current drug laws. You call it prohibition, but current drug laws. I won't get into any kind of debate regarding that, but the fact of the matter is there's a lot of gang-related and organized crime-related murders, not constantly, but to a certain degree. Anyway, thank God we've got Cathy Scott on the line, so I'm going to put her right on, and we'll get going with this program. Thanks very much for being comfortable with this. And Cathy, are you on the line?
I just got back from San Diego. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Cathy. Thank you for joining the program.
Mm-hmm.
I was boring the audience there while we waited for you. So.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
No problem. Thank you very much for agreeing to this program. So let me start off with, I guess, one of my stock questions that I normally ask of guests because I'm very curious. what made you come to the decision to write a book about Susan Berman, the daughter of infamous Vegas mobster Davie Berman?
Well, what struck me, I mean, I remember exactly where I was when I heard the news. I was out on a multi-day bicycle ride, actually, and we had ridden all day, and we had a TV on in the room. Everybody just kind of preparing for the next day, and the news came on, and always Vegas, because I live in Vegas, and there's always a Vegas-related story that's interesting to me. I like to write about underdogs, and they just couldn't seem. I followed the case, and they couldn't seem to find the killer, and so I gravitate toward that sort of thing to try to, I don't know if I can say try to help, but, try to get to the bottom of it and kind of investigate it myself. And I just think it's a sad case. I think it's sad that whoever killed her has not been brought to justice. It's I feel like I know Susan. I came close to meeting her, but I never did. And I think her story needed to be told.
Okay, let's go back now a little bit to give people a background. Davie Berman, we need to know a little bit about him. What I thought was interesting, living in Winnipeg here for the past 16 years, is that Davie Berman volunteered for the Army up in Canada to fight in the Second World War. Tell us about why he joined the Canadian Army and how did he fare in the military. Tell us a little bit about that story. I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, America wanted to take him. He had a bit of a record, and they wanted, sure. It was obvious. I mean, he was into gambling and, in Minnesota and stuff, and he, everybody knew he hung out with, not hung out, but he was one of the mobsters. He was coming up in the ranks and in the Mafia and really the Jewish Mafia back then. And what was that, I think they moved to Vegas around 45, didn't they?
Right.
40. I think Susan was 6 months old when she moved here. So it was long before he'd met her mother and his brother Chicky, who stayed by his side, his whole life. He joined up too, and he ended up being. I don't have the book in front of me, but he ended up being decorated, with what he did, and did actually an exemplary job. And he wanted to fight and be part of the, help, and he and so the Canadians welcomed him with open arms.
Right. It's just that, it's an interesting
the era
aspect.
Was people wanted to join up in the military back then. The guys were dying to get in.
Sure. Sure.
But go
now,
ahead.
So he was honorably discharged from the military, and then you had alluded to it a little bit. He does have a criminal background for robbery and did some time about 7 years before any of this Las Vegas situation happened. But tell us a little bit more about Davie Berman, the character. I found it very interesting. You say he wanted to volunteer for the military. He did an exemplary job. He was decorated. The thing is, tell us a little bit about his character. Was he a hard-drinking, womanizing guy, gambler? Tell us about who Davie Berman was. It's because it seems to be a very interesting aspect of the contrast, Davie Berman, the gangster, and...
Well, he actually, his demeanor and whatnot, he was rather quiet, charming, but quiet, and he certainly wasn't a Tony Spilotro or anything like that. I mean, these were gentlemen, if you can call them that, gentlemen mafia, and it was the Jewish mob, and, Meyer Lansky came here, and, Bugsy Siegel, of course, took over the Flamingo, and, hooked up with, they all were hooked up together. And they brought in people to help run it, and Davie was brought in was he in Minnesota at that time? I think he was brought in to run the Flamingo Hotel. And here he went to synagogue every Saturday. Like he told Susan, he'd go by the synagogue and tell her, I built that for you. He did it, of course, because I verified it. People in their 80s who said, nope, the boys down the street may have donated some money, and he may have been one of them, but he didn't build it. But he was just here in Las Vegas. They'd almost come here to legitimize himself because they'd become philanthropists, and they named them pillars of the community. And there was an understanding that they could come here and do business, but they couldn't kill within the borders. You want to do anything like that, you go outside the border of Nevada and across the state line, and it's fine. So they actually legitimized themselves here, and they were allowed to do the rackets, and everybody knew they were skimming, for the mob, and
right.
And that's what he did. But he was a nice man. He was, Susan was in love with her father. She was a daddy's girl, and he was a nice man. His brother Chicky was a little out of hand and not a leader, but Davie was a leader, but very quiet and he kept a low profile.
Now, let's go back a little bit, too. Tell us a little bit about Susan's mother, Gladys. What was she really like, and what was her life as a wife of a mobster? How did things work with Gladys?
Well, it actually scared her to death, and she didn't know, of course, that he was in the Mafia when she married him, and he brought her and Susie to Las Vegas to run, he was going to have a high position in the Flamingo Hotel. And, of course, jump forward a little bit, Susan, of course, she didn't learn until she was in college what he did. At least that's what she said. And but there was one of her, I know that, her mother had a couple of nervous breakdowns because of the pressure. And, when they built their house, they had a cute little English tutor on downtown on 7th Avenue, I believe it was, 6th or 7th, and cute. And now it's a little teeny tiny law office, but the back window, and you can go by it and see it on the alley, the back window was really, really high in her bedroom, and they raised it so there couldn't be a drive-by shooting. And so Gladys knew what he did, and when there'd be mob uprising, he would send them to L.A., or he'd go with them, and they go hang out and stay at the Bel Air or the Beverly Hills Hotel and shop and that sort of thing, and take her to. Sometimes they go to New York, but most part they just go to Los Angeles to get away. And then when things would settle down, they'd come back into town. So Gladys didn't take it well, and she went away when she left when Susan was still in grade school. They put her in what assisted living, whatever it was back then, a rest home.
Right.
And she had shock treatments and all of that. So her mother, it was sad. It was a sad existence for her mother. So she wasn't the typical, mob wife who enjoyed going to parties and stuff like that. It wasn't like that.
Right.
They kept a low profile. He had meetings at the house, all the big guys, and there was a bodyguard who basically lived with them and took Susan everywhere.
Right.
And would go to L.A. with them.
So it was a pretty protected existence for Susan, and it was very separate from what we might think as a mob existence or a mob lifestyle. She was very isolated from that.
Yeah, she was. I mean, the interesting thing is you can go to the library, and I did. I went to one of the main libraries, and you can pick up you can go look at the old telephone books, and I have it in the book, but you go to, and you thumb through the telephone books, and you can look up, down 7th Avenue, 6th Avenue, 4th Avenue. All the mob guys lived there. You just look them up.
Yeah.
The names are all in the phone book. And that was part of it. It was almost like a guise, they were just regular Joes, and they were accepted and never questioned. And you ask anybody, I did a story a while back for, I think it was Israeli Light or something. It was a few years ago. And they interviewed a lot of children who went to school during that time, and they felt safe. And a couple of them said, nothing ever happened when we had the mob run in the town.
Right.
It was a safer place, and people didn't lock their doors, and they didn't give anybody in town any trouble. They did whatever they did, but, nobody talked about it. Didn't make the papers much.
Sure. Now, a name everyone will recognize is that of Bugsy Siegel, played by Warren Beatty in Bugsy. And please explain you've alluded to it, but please explain the actual arrangement that existed involving Siegel, Davie Berman, and Meyer Lansky in regards to the Flamingo. And then, as sort of an additional question, what happened after Bugsy was killed? So maybe you can tell us about. It's talked about in the movie. I don't, you did the research, so I don't know how accurate every aspect of it is. But talk to us for those.
I mean, I've got the most of it down, but Davie wasn't the person who ran, he helped run the casino when he came in, and Bugsy Siegel was, he practically begged to come into Vegas and said he could do it. And, they didn't really have a high-end casino at that time, and it was considered, the Flamingo was considered way south on the Strip, as far as south as you could go. And it was just nothing but desert all around them. And he had all these lofty ideas, and he bought it from a guy named, is it Wilkins? He bought the Flamingo from a guy who went belly up. He tried to build a hotel and couldn't finish building it, couldn't get it off the ground, couldn't get enough backers, and so Bugsy talked the mob into buying it, and they bankrolled him, and he would run it, and Bugsy was ticking off a few people in the mob, and for whatever reason, they offed him, and waiting in the casino at that moment, and they got a phone call. It's done, or it's over, or whatever. And that from the moment he was shot and they got word, they instantly hadn't even made the news yet. Of course, back then it wasn't in the papers for another day. And the moment he was dead, they took over the Flamingo, and that's when Davie started. He was the head guy, and it was also him. And then it was the Jewish mob allowed the Italians in. So it's and it all sort of intertwined itself, but whether that was by design or not, to bring him in for better appearances and not being Italian or something, I don't know, but it seemed to work very well back then. That's how he took over, and he was the anointed one when Bugsy died to be the one who ran the place.
Right. Now, Susan's father, Davie Berman, died in 1957. How did he die, and was there any question as to how he had died and why?
Well, he actually had surgery in Henderson, nearby Henderson, at a hospital. But he, I believe it was gallbladder surgery or one of those types of surgeries. And Susie was 12 years old, and it was just he was going in for surgery, and he. In all the research I did, what I found was they had left a sponge inside of him or something, and he got an infection and died. Sure. Which, as we know, those things happen. But it was questioned. It came up in the old newspaper articles when he died. I pulled all the stories when, the Review Journal and the Las Vegas Sun, and a couple of, I think there was another one, Las Vegas Independent or something like that, saying that some questioned it, but that there was nothing to it, that he died in surgery. I don't know that he had, if there was any motive to kill him, but then Susan's mother, when he died, was in, an assisted living place in L.A., so they moved Susan from Las Vegas to L.A. to be near her mother, but she lived in a separate apartment away from her, I believe, and the bodyguard went with her. And then her mother died the next year. Am I jumping too soon?
No. That's she died. The following year.
Year when she was 13.
How did she die? And was there any speculation as to what happened to her? And
Susan
why?
Susan later questioned it both. You have to understand Susan. I mean, she would question it later, but Susan, it's like emotionally, she, when her parents died, especially her father, because she was so close to him, her whole world changed. And
sure.
She basically was stuck in Las Vegas, planted there firmly at age 12, and emotionally didn't really, intellectually, of course, she grew, but emotionally, she was firmly planted in Las Vegas, and, she remembers things as a little girl, and, not all of them, panned out. She wrote a beautiful book about it, Easy Street, but her mother died, and she supposedly died. I think she died of a broken heart, but she supposedly died of an overdose, or she was young. Her mother was young, but Right. But wasn't really, she kind of checked out from motherhood, and her father was raising her, and then the bodyguard, of course, Lou, who she loved, and then, as soon as she died, because Susan said she was killed, her mother was killed because of the money, but they still had to pay Susan. I mean, Susan got a lot of money over the years. She had a trust fund when she turned 21, and Chickie actually lived off part of it. Her uncle, he whisked her away to Oregon, then put her in Chadwick, private school, and where she went to school with Liza Minnelli and people like that. And he was taking the money, and then when she turned, he put her in college, and she went to UCLA, and he was living off of that money. She got a lot of money over the years, so that motivation of money to kill the mother doesn't make sense because, he owned part of the Riviera, part of the Flamingo, some apartment buildings and things like that, and so the proceeds Susan lived, had for years. So that doesn't make sense because it wasn't like they didn't pay anybody. They paid her or they paid the mother. It didn't make any difference. But there was never evidence. Nobody ever investigated it as a homicide.
Right. Now, you talk about Susan, and she chose to pursue a writing career. How did she fare with that? You already mentioned that she wrote one book, but what did she write about in the very beginning?
Well, she went. I interviewed the dean of students because she went to. First she went to UCLA, and that's where she met Bobby Durst. But she went to who would be her lifelong friend, and later a suspect in a murder. But she met him there, and then she transferred to UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, and went to their journalism school, or as we say, J School. And I interviewed the dean of the J School, and it was interesting. I interviewed a couple of people who attended school with her, and one who went on to work at the Los Angeles Times. And she she was bored with school, and she didn't try hard, and things seemed to come easy to her. And the dean told me that he liked her, and he and his wife were really good friends with her and stayed friends with her, up until her death. But he said he was very disappointed when the San Francisco Examiner offered her a job because he thought it was too easy. It came too easily to her, as so many things did. She was spoiled. Right. And so she sort of felt entitled as a mob daughter, and she would tell everybody that that her father was a mobster, and but she didn't last long at the Chronicle, or the Examiner rather, because she didn't get along with people, and she didn't want to work hard. And while she was in San Francisco, she Herb Kahn, Caen. Yeah, he was a big columnist there, and she used to hang out at this grill, and she was in his column all the time. So she kind of became a big, big deal. Susan's best years were San Francisco, and, after that, of course, she went to New York. Her best years were there. And when she went to L.A., everything went downhill for a very long time.
Right. When and exactly how, because it's a very interesting part of your book, did Susan discover who her father really was in terms of his mafia criminal background? And what did she do as a result? How did she react?
Well, it was someone she knew. I think someone she knew from college, and someone called her, and at the time she was living in, I think at that time she had moved to New York. I mean, she's still in college, tell people, but in high school I talked to people she grew up with. Oh, by the way, if I can backtrack to her childhood, a kid named Pat Bailey, who I've interviewed a lot and several times, and he actually went to her father's wake. And it's true in the book that she threw herself. He was there. She threw herself into her father's coffin during the funeral. Wow. She was always very dramatic and never got over it. But he said that his parents, while he could play at her house, he was allowed to play at her house or take the limo down to parties and stuff. He was one of her few friends in school. His parents would not allow her into their home, which is rather interesting. They let him go there, but they wouldn't let her. You know what I mean? Sure. Interesting. But anyway, she met this guy at a bar. They had a planned meeting, and he wanted to tell her something, and she went there, and he pulled out mugshot or something, or a wanted. I think it was a wanted poster that she actually hung on her wall. Sorry, I'm at a coffee lounge actually outside. Sorry about that. And he told her, this is who your father was, and he opened up a book, and in it he found a page, and it said who Chickie was, and it said who her father was, and so then she didn't believe him, so then she went to a bookstore and looked up every book she could find, and she went to the library and found every reference, and then she found that her dad, but there wasn't that much written about him, but she confirmed. So she did a Freedom of Information Act, pulled the FOIA, as we call it. You paper the FBI and the feds, and she sent in paperwork, and she got her father's file, and it was, several boxes, and went through it. And from that, she never planned to, write a nonfiction book. She'd been writing, she'd started some, fiction, novels, which she did well with those. And from that came Easy Street, the book Easy Street, which they were going to turn into a movie too. But
right now, what was it? What was it about?
Easy Street is very good, by the way.
Yes, it's highly acclaimed. Everyone talks about what a great book it was, and her follow-up, Lady Las Vegas, not so much.
It was awful.
What is the book about specifically? Was it completely true, and how was it accepted by critics, and how did members of the Mafia react?
Mafia didn't seem to care, about the book, because Susan didn't know anything, and this was how many years later? 15 years later or something, but or 10, whatever it was, and she had, because of who she was, she had, entree into, Vegas, the people who run Vegas, including Steve Wynn and his wife Elaine. They helped her on the A&E special she was on later. She helped produce that, helped write it, and also in her later, Lady Las Vegas, she had, entree into that whole group of people that other people can't penetrate. And so actually it helped her, and they didn't care because she didn't know anything. And nothing new was happening. But she was on, Jane Pauley interviewed her. I think she was on CBS or something.
Right.
And she had a full-on book tour. And, nobody owns the rights to that book right now. A few people are trying to get it, but Dial Press, I think, nobody knows who owns it. So the book is out of print and has been for a long time. A lot of people have tried to grab it up and can't. But but the interesting thing on that is she had a movie deal come through, and Susan collected people, and she collected people who could be useful to her in her career, people in the music industry, publishing industry, and she knew a guy at a record company, and so he kind of acted as a quasi agent, and she was paid, I don't remember, it was $187,000 or something as a movie option, and then she was so difficult to work with that they killed the movie deal.
Right.
She never got over that. She didn't have to pay the money back, but she never got over that. And she grew more and more eccentric as she got older.
What was Easy Street? Was it memoir-esque? What was Easy Street?
It was memoir-esque, a little, through the rose-colored glasses of a 12-year-old, but written by an adult. The style is just such a nice style, and I quote from it in the book. But there was things like saying, my dad built the first synagogue in Las Vegas. Well, no, he didn't. They may have attended it, but no, they didn't. That's Shalom. And things that she kind of, she said she was kidnapped. I could find no, court records or criminal records on it, but she said she was kidnapped out front. She was at Fifth Avenue School is where she attended school, which was just 2 blocks from her house, 2 short blocks. And some man opened the door and grabbed her and threw her in the back seat. And there were a bunch of comic books on the back seat with her. And as he started to drive, I guess he drove away and stopped at the stoplight, and she kicked in the door, and she was 8 years old and got out. And, I mean, that's her side of the story. We don't know. But things like that she has in it. And it's just interesting about her mom and her dad. And she, you know, she kind of downplays in some respects, she downplays the role of her father because she knew that he was, you know, he at one point had been a hitman apparently, but she downplays that sort of thing about him. It's very rose-colored glasses, but a good read, and you learn a lot. If anybody wants to get it, you can buy it used off of Amazon. It's expensive, but you can buy it.
Interesting. Yeah, going back with the FBI, too, what I thought was interesting is that one of the things that was said to her, either through the FBI or the reporter that blabbed his mouth about the father, or the person that told her about her father's background, was that they said, matter of factly, oh, yeah, he was a trained killer. So
yeah, he could kill him. He could kill a man with one arm behind his back and the other, And that's a famous line that she'd said it on the Jane Pauley show. She said it on a radio show later, you know, This American Life. I think she was on with a couple of other mob kids or, you know, relatives of mobsters, and she always would quote that line. Because it was in a book that he was, I mean, but he wasn't he didn't have that hardened look, or, you know, he didn't have, if you saw him on the street, you wouldn't have thought that. He didn't have, you know, the Vegas look, you know, the slick back hair and kind of just sort of the thug look, and the type of suits and stuff. He was quite a sharp dresser, too, apparently. But he didn't have that, and he wasn't a tough guy, and people who worked for him loved him. I interviewed Bill Miller, who was a couple of years, I think he was a couple of years younger than Susan, and he became actually governor. And his father went to prison for, I forget what, but he was kind of hooked up with the mob a little bit. And it was Bob Miller, and Bob Miller was a lifeguard, you know, at the Flamingo, and he would always be invited to Susan's parties. There'd always be kids of the workers who were invited to her parties, kids she didn't know very well. And he said, you know, everybody loved Davie, that he was a gentleman and treated employees with respect. So he didn't push his weight around or anything like that. He was like a gentleman mobster.
And Susan had no problem, I guess you could call it exploiting that relationship she had with, or that information she had, and those behind-the-scenes people in Vegas, and romanticizing the entire mafia as well, the mob in Vegas, which included her father. So she had no problem doing that.
Yeah.
That's really what
nobody. Yeah, that's what she did, and nobody seemed to care. I mean, like she bragged about Elvis and a birthday party, and Liberace and birthday parties, and Jimmy Durante giving her gifts, and you know, she was Susan was a name dropper, and it's interesting that she tried to hook up the people she stayed friends with were famous or infamous. You know what I mean?
Sure.
If somebody wasn't useful to her, for the most part, she didn't keep them as friends. It was interesting, kind of what it definitely had an effect on her growing up in that environment as really a mob princess, because she was spoiled, you know, spoiled girl.
Yes.
And then the rest of her life, she felt entitled.
Sure. Now, you talked about Robert or Bobby Durst, and they met in college, but can you tell us a little bit more about when and how they met? You said at college, but how did they meet? Was the relationship intimate, and what kind of relationship was it?
Yeah, they were. She always referred to him as the brother she never had. They met at he was a year or two older than her, I think, but he only attended UCLA for a year, and he was there for a graduate degree, which he didn't finish, and Susan was there for her undergraduate. And they met in the quad, you know, outdoors in, you know, the sitting areas where the kids, you know, the students sit, and they met out there. And their common interests were that their mothers had died. He actually witnessed his mother committing suicide by jumping off the family roof. And he was on the ground when she landed.
Jeez.
And every you know, profiles have been done on him and said that affected him. So right then they had, she was you know, her mother died as well, and when she was young, and so they had that commonality. And just sort of intellectually, he was, he came from a the Durst Corporation and the huge real estate owners and developers in Manhattan, and which came in handy for Durst later when his wife was missing. But never romantic. She wasn't interested in him, and vice versa. But they'd see each other, and then she basically followed him to New York because that's where he lived. So she, after working at the Examiner, she freelanced at City Lights, wrote an article, How to Get Laid in San Francisco, and back then it was a big deal. And that kind of made her famous, and she used that to get into New York and get with New York Magazine hired her. So and then she saw Bobby a lot. They'd go to Elaine's, and a whole group of people would go, and Lorraine Newman from Saturday Night Live was one of their friends, and they just had this whole following of people.
Now, was Bobby Durst a real eccentric character at that time? And also, you didn't mention that you mentioned that she was a mob princess and felt she was entitled, but she felt entitled, and she, like you say, she knew people that were powerful and or famous and or wealthy. Bobby Durst gave her money, but there's other people that gave her money as well, so that wouldn't be so unusual. But tell us a little bit about that, and tell us, because you don't talk too much about it, but about the behavior of Bobby Durst at that time. Was he a real eccentric guy? Because later his behavior is quite different.
No, he was quiet. Sometimes you have to watch out for the quiet people. Still waters run deep. And in Bobby Durst's case, that was it. But he met Cathy Durst in New York, and she was very sweet and normal and wanted to go to was attending medical school. And there were people who I interviewed for the book who said that, at parties when Cathy would go and Susan would be there too. And she was Cathy's friend, but she was Bobby's friend first, that Bobby was controlling over her about, where she'd go and who she'd talk to and that sort of thing. It was never that way with Susan. But then Bobby's, they had a fight, and Bobby's wife ends up missing, and someone called the medical school to say that she wouldn't be attending. It was a woman, and everybody believes, and I believe it too, that Susan was his alibi, and was because she, I forget what the alibi was, but she confirmed something, and then was the one they believe who called in, saying that the wife wouldn't be attending school. So it's and that's a deep, deep secret to hold for someone, and she fielded the media request for him, which was a big deal after Cathy Durst. It was a huge story in Manhattan after she was missing, and she's never been found, and her body hasn't been, and they declared her dead, years later. But Susan fielded and did all the interviews for Bobby.
So she was very
all the media.
So she was very supportive. But police didn't find out immediately, though, that the actual time of death, or they didn't put together that someone had made a call, and it certainly wasn't Cathy, and it must have been some other woman. So this doesn't happen right away. Bobby Durst has the ability to avoid charges initially for this. He didn't report that his wife was missing for, 3, 4, 5 days, something like that. He walked into Manhattan. It wasn't living in Manhattan, but they had an apartment in Manhattan, and they lived. Excuse me, I can't remember where they lived, but it wasn't in the city. But they had an apartment there, and she would stay there sometimes when Cathy would, when she'd have to attend classes. And so he didn't report it right away. And I went to the Manhattan station and interviewed, a couple of people there, the cops, and asked why wasn't this investigated? They did not investigate it as a homicide. They took his word for it, didn't do any searches for a while, and didn't ever really look at it as a homicide. It was just a missing person, and they said she ran off.
which of course, they had a terrible fight. She was visiting a friend that night at a party, and, the Cathy Najami, who is very good friends with Cathy Durst, and believes in her heart of hearts that Bobby Durst is her killer. And, people have tried to connect that to Susan's murder later, that she was going to spill the beans, and so Bobby offed her because of it.
Now, explain that. Bobby and, for the logic of that, Bobby has a relationship with Susan. He's the prime suspect in the death of his murder, in the murder of his wife. And Susan, you talk about in the book, Susan told at least one person, if not more, that he had admitted that he had killed his wife. So that's part of the logic, right?
Yeah, she told, and, she kept a secret, if it's true, she kept a secret for a very long time. And Susan wasn't good with money. She would come into lots of money, and she never told her friends that, at one point she was given, $1.3 million or something. She was given it in increments 21, which, her uncle bought her, in college, he bought her a convertible Mercedes-Benz. And she, it was the middle of the Vietnam era, too. It was kind of out of place at UC Berkeley. And at 21, she got a lot of money. It paid for her education, too, and her support. And then 25, she got a chunk, and 30, I think, was when, either 25 or 30 is when she got the $1.3 million, I think. She got large amounts. And then later, there was some property that sold that her dad partially owned, and she got a payment from that, too. And she always complained that she didn't get any money from the mob, and it wasn't true. And because I pulled up all the financial records, they're all filed with the state. And Davie's name is on them, and then her name is on it too, as the dare. But she went to Bobby. She didn't have any money. She couldn't get work. It was when she was in L.A., and she went to Bobby for money. She needed a car, and she needed support. She was being booted out of the place she lived in, the house she lived in. And Bobby made, that's when he was missing in Texas, but she didn't know it. And I'm jumping the gun, but he was living as a woman, a mute woman, and he sent her 2 separate checks for $25,000 each. And people say, well, that was payola, but that was Bobby. We don't know what he gave her over the years. He could have given her other large checks that she never told anybody about,
Right. Now, the thing is, what I don't know if it's clear, but is that the murder case was reopened. The Cathy Durst murder case was reopened. And then,
it was about they wanted to interview Susan. Yes, that's an integral part of the story.
Yeah, so Gilberta Najami said that there was a leak by police, and she blamed police because Bobby Durst, she claimed that Bobby Durst then knew that Susan was going to be questioned about the Cathy Durst case, and obviously there was information that was known to police, or they believed that someone had made a call, which was a woman. And so that makes a lot more sense for a motive for Bobby Durst to have this murder. Correct?
And he doesn't have an alibi, which I reveal in the book. His attorney Dick DeGuerin, who, Bobby Durst's attorney, who is a very good one. One of the top 100. He's been named in the defense attorneys in the country. She was. Shortly before Susan's death, a newspaper article came out citing that the case, the Cathy Durst disappearance case, was being reopened, and Susan was a person of interest that they were trying to get a hold of to interview. And then Susan had told a couple of her friends that the stuff was going to hit the fan, that there was some information she had, and then they assumed, oh, Susan, it's just another mob story. Nobody cares anymore. That part of the mob is so old. But in retrospect, they looked at it and said she was probably talking about Bobby. Would Susan have done? I mean, she was loyal to a T. That's one thing she learned from her father is, you don't narc on people. You keep secrets. I mean, if it's true, she kept a secret for a very long time for Bobby. So what would motivate her? He just gave her money. What would motivate her to, turn,
right.
become a witness for the state? I mean, I don't. Maybe he worried she would. But whoever came to her house that night, she let that person in. And she had also another clue to putting Bobby Durst next to the murder is she told some friends that Bobby was going to come and visit her. He was in San Francisco. He was going to be in San Francisco because he had a place there, a condo in the city, and he was going to go to L.A. and visit her. And he was going to take her back to San Francisco is what she told friends.
Now, what you haven't explained, and I'm just very curious, is that you just talk about his cross-dressing and posing as a mute woman. Did he just all of a sudden start cross-dressing? Did he start cross-dressing just because he needed a disguise? Is this just part of strange behavior? Yeah. What is going on with this?
I think it's a little bit of both. The guy was definitely, as he got older, was eccentric, but so was Susan. So I think that was part of the appeal with each other is they both were eccentric, and I think they were damaged. She was damaged by the loss of her parents. He was damaged by the suicide in front of him at age 7. So they both were damaged. But yeah, he went to Galveston Bay because I think he went there in disguise because the Cathy Durst investigation was closing in on him, and so he goes to Galveston Bay to a little crummy area of town and. Near the water, near Galveston Bay, and rents this little motel, kind of a weekly rental or whatever they are. Just imagine a little beach place. And his neighbor is
Morris Black,
right? Morris Black, and an older guy, and they befriend each other. And apparently, he pissed off. Bobby, and he said that there was a gun and it was drawn, but he didn't mean to pull the trigger, and that he accidentally killed one Morris Black, and so to get rid of him, he got a chainsaw, and he sawed him up in the rental and put him in bags and dropped him in Galveston Bay. And then a fisherman and his 12-year-old son were out fishing and came across
body parts.
I think it was the head first. And can you imagine that poor kid? And
sure.
And then he went on the lam after he dropped the body parts into the bay. He then went on the lam, and he was caught shoplifting a sandwich. And they pulled him. Yeah, they pulled him up and they let him go. So he was on the lam for a little while until they finally got him. So while she was, but in between, I talked to Dick DeGuerin. It was interesting, and I love it when things like this happen as we're writing our stories. It's like a gift to an author, But I was interviewing Dick DeGuerin, and said, Bobby was never interviewed by the police for Susan's murder. So the LAPD kind of dropped the ball in a couple of ways. He was never interviewed. Dick was, and so I asked Mr. DeGuerin if Bobby had an alibi. He goes, well, he's got an alibi. He was in San Francisco. He was in the air, headed from San Francisco to New York when she was killed. Well, that wasn't accurate. He was in the air when her body was found, but she'd been dead for 24 hours, which gave him ample time. Yeah, it's an hour flight from San Francisco to L.A. That's a 4-hour drive, 5-hour drive, 4.5. Yeah. And I've done it. And so he actually had plenty of time. What was he doing the day before? Friday night. And whoever left. Bobby was also one of the things they had in common. He's a huge animal lover, and he apparently had an Afghan dog, and she had 3 wire terriers and hyper little dogs, and whoever killed her left the back door open so those dogs could come and go. And that's how they found out her body was in there, because her dogs were running in the front yard on Benedict Canyon Road.
Right,
so,
right.
yeah, I mean, it all points to him, but they say they don't have enough evidence. And I'm like, God, wasn't there less evidence in the O.J. case?
Well, but you do explain, though, too, that someone commented, at least theorized, and I see examples of this where you already have them on a first-degree murder charge doing life without parole. It takes a lot of effort to mount a case and a lot of money, and you have to have a lot of evidence. So,
yeah, but I mean, there's circumstantial evidence too. They can use circumstantial. I mean, it's interesting. They didn't really pursue him. They didn't. No. They should have immediately. It's like her, and then you've got another person of interest at the time. They say he's no longer a person of interest, but her manager. And if you want to call him a manager, he was a friend. She met him at apartment complex when she lived off of Sunset. Lived for free, by the way, for 5 years, and an actress's, singer's apartment who offered her when she, filed bankruptcy. She offered that Susan could live in that apartment with her ex-boyfriend's daughter, and Susan stayed for 5 years. Can you imagine? She just had a way of people did things for her, I mean, people who knew her and they loved her, but they were also exasperated by her, I mean, she offers her someplace to live temporarily, and she stays 5 years.
Yeah.
And they had to do quite some cleaning because she had 3 dogs in there, and and nobody'd been in there in years, and I guess the place was a mess. But that's where she met her manager, and walking her dogs on the street, and he was walking his. And he just kind of took over managing her, but she never paid him. And he was upset with her because she owed him money. And he actually broke into the house the day Susan's body was found, and he broke into the house looking for her bank records. So, but they didn't search his house or office for 2 months. So they dropped the ball in some respects because they didn't get Bobby Durst, never interviewed him, just his attorney, and, never checked for, fingerprints or whatever, matching whatever they could on him. And, when when he was ultimately arrested for the Morris Black murder, which he got off, Dick DeGuerin got him acquitted on self-defense. And in the trunk of his car were 2 guns, and one was a 9mm. Susan was shot with a 9mm, and the ballistics on that, because Susan was shot once in the back of the head, out of her, going into her spare room, and like somebody was following her into the room, but it was someone she knew, and the ballistics on that gun and the bullet at her house were inconclusive. So there you go.
Yeah. Interesting. So what's the latest update on this whole case, Bobby Durst? What's the latest wrap up on this thing here?
Well, I don't know that they're ever going to do anything. I mean, I talked to the lead investigator on the case, and they're they get leads periodically, but nothing major, and they admit that mistakes were made. But even if Bobby Durst, he told me, Paul Coulter, even if Bobby Durst came in and said, I did it, they'd still have to have evidence that he did. So they don't have the evidence they say, I mean, I've seen circumstantial cases come in with less, and you let the jury decide, or you let the grand jury decide whether they want to indict him. But they never put this thing forward. I mean, he got a pass from Manhattan because of who his father was. Seymour Durst, huge. I mean, he owned half of Manhattan, and he seems to have gotten the pass ever since. And he had one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the country. You can't blame him, really. I mean, the guy's not been convicted of murder. And he's connected. He's tied to 3 murders. And never been convicted. So I don't know. I think it's one of 2 people in the case, but they're I don't short of finding the smoking gun, I don't know that this case will ever be solved.
Yeah, it sure points to Bobby Durst, though. It makes a lot of sense.
It points to, the manager a little. He was acting strange, and you notice I don't use his name, but he just kind of some things that just don't add up with him. But yeah, Bobby, it looks like Bobby did it, but it would be the biggest double cross of the century if he did do that. I mean, the way I look at it, just because he killed someone else doesn't mean he killed her. You know what I mean?
Sure.
But it's hard to say. The case wasn't handled, as it could have been.
Yeah.
So we'll never know certain points. But it's fascinating. I think it's sad. I think it's sad that no one has come to justice in her case. She was a sad character, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was, and it's a fascinating tale because of all of its historical background, information that you're providing, and it's almost biographical about a mob princess and person trying to write. So it's very interesting too. Her whole life, like you say, Liberace and Elvis coming to her birthday party. It is a real glimpse into the real story, not the Hollywood version. So it's a great book.
Thank you. And it's a whole different era that's gone. That is not the Vegas of today, know. And so it is a real snapshot into what it was like back then.
Yeah, it's about the only part of the mob that could be romanticized, because there was some aspect of a little bit of charm and a little bit of class, despite being thugs. So it's definitely the good old days of crime. When crime was a little more civilized, unbelievably. If it could be. But I want to thank you
the boys on the street. I love the way that one woman said, the boys down the street. Those are the mob on the strip. But anyway, you're welcome. Sure. I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate you giving me the time.
Well, thank you very much for a great interview and about a great book. People have been listening to Murder of a Mafia Daughter, The Life and Tragic Death of Susan Berman, with my guest, Cathy Scott. Thank you very much, Cathy. Have yourself a good evening.
Thank you, Dan. You too.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them, with your host, Dan Zupansky. Join me next week. Good night.